What if I told you one of history's most terrifying tyrants wasn't a grizzled warlord or a cruel emperor, but a child? A boy king, crowned before his 10th birthday, who believed he was chosen by God to cleanse his kingdom with fire, fear, and blood. His reign lasted only a handful of years, but what he left behind still haunts his nation's legacy. This is the story of Adrian IV, the boy king. Section 1. The Prophecy Child. When you think of great dynasties, you might picture warrior kings or wise queens whose legacies reshaped entire nations. But hidden among those gilded stories are darker tales, stories of heirs who should never have ruled, whose brief reigns cast shadows long after their deaths. This is the story of Adrian IV, the boy king of Ormandia. Crowned at just 9 years old, he inherited not only a fractured kingdom, but also a dangerous vision planted deep in his mind by those who raised him. His reign was not remembered for triumphs or glory, but for fear of a child convinced he was chosen by God to purify his land. Adrian was born in the autumn of 1539, a child long prayed for by his father, King Malric II. The king had buried 2 sons already, both dead before their 3rd birthdays, and his desperation for a male heir had driven him to paranoia. When Adrian finally came into the world, weak and red-faced but breathing, the bells of the capital tolled for 3 days straight. The price of that birth, however, was his mother's life. Queen Isolde bled out within hours of delivery, her cries echoing through the stone corridors until they fell silent forever. Malric held the swaddled infant in his arms, but his eyes were already hollow. "This child is the kingdom's salvation," he declared to his council. "And if God takes him, he takes us all." From that moment, Adrian was never treated as a son. He was treated as a prophecy. The boy grew up within the high walls of Alderstone Palace, guarded like a relic and praised like a saint. Nurses, courtiers, and tutors bowed when he entered a room. He was told at every meal, in every lesson, that his life had divine purpose. Unlike other children, Adrian never played with sticks in the garden or laughed in the kitchens. He sat in vaulted chambers, reciting scripture and philosophy under the watchful gaze of men who saw in him not a boy, but a weapon. Among them, none had more influence than Matthias Runn, a stern, ascetic theologian whose narrow eyes rarely softened. Matthias believed Ormandia was destined to become the beacon of the true faith, cleansed of corruption. And to achieve this destiny, he molded the child king with words as sharp as blades. "You are chosen," Matthias whispered one night as the boy struggled to copy a passage of scripture. "Chosen to cut rot from the tree of this kingdom. Mercy is weakness. Purity is strength." Adrian's small hand trembled around the quill. But he did not protest. He never did. Section 2. Childhood without play. Adrian's earliest memories were not of laughter but of lessons. His chambers smelled of ink and wax, and his companions were not playmates but parchment scrolls. By the age of 6, he could argue points of doctrine most priests stumbled over. By 7, he had memorized entire books of scripture, not merely the words, but their true interpretation, as Matthias called it. Other boys learned to ride ponies or chase dogs through the courtyards. Adrian learned how to identify heresy in a sermon. One cold winter evening, his half-sister Elira, the daughter of Malric's first marriage, dared to sneak into his chambers. She was 12 then, 3 years older, and possessed a spark of warmth that Adrian found disorienting. "Do you never tire of these books?" she asked, holding up a candle to peer at the dense Latin script. Adrian blinked at her. "I must read them. Father says knowledge is my duty." "But knowledge of what?" Elira countered, her voice low. "The world is more than words on a page. Have you ever seen the river freeze? Or the hawks nesting by the cliffs?" Adrian frowned. His mind reached for Matthias's teachings. "Idle sights distract from God's plan." She laughed, though it sounded almost sad. "You're 9 going on 90. She touched his sleeve gently. "You are my brother, Adrian. Not just a king to be. Remember that." The boy felt something then, a flicker of longing he couldn't name. But before he could answer, footsteps echoed in the corridor. Matthias's cold voice followed. Princess Elira, you will leave His Majesty to his studies. His Majesty. Even then, Elira's visits grew fewer, and soon Adrian forgot the warmth of her voice. Instead, he absorbed Matthias's lessons. Compassion breeds weakness. Kings must choose fire over forgiveness. One night, Adrian dreamed of Elira laughing by a riverbank. In the dream, Matthias appeared, whispering in his ear, "That laughter is sin. She must be corrected." Adrian woke in a sweat, both terrified and exhilarated. Section 3. The Boy Crowned. When King Malric II died suddenly of fever in the summer of 1548, Ormandia was thrown into chaos. Adrian was 9. Too young, most whispered. Too fragile. But the coronation proceeded with terrifying swiftness. The crown, heavy with iron and emeralds, nearly toppled his head forward when placed upon him. But Matthias Run stood behind the boy, murmuring prayers like incantations, and Adrian steadied himself. "Behold your sovereign," Matthias proclaimed. "Chosen by God Himself." The crowd cheered, not out of joy, but fear. The Regency Council, led by Adrian's uncle Lord Garrick Thorne, expected to guide the boy quietly, ruling in his name. But they underestimated how deeply Matthias had molded him. In the first council meeting, Adrian interrupted Garrick's measured plans for tax relief with a sharp, childish voice. "No. We must first address the heresy festering in our land. God will not bless Ormandia until it is cleansed." The room fell silent. Garrick tried to smile. "Your Majesty, perhaps such matters." Silence. Adrian slammed his fist on the table. "Would you defy God's chosen?" It was the first time Garrick saw the fire in the boy's eyes. It would not be the last. Section 4. The First Flames of Cruelty. Within months of his coronation, Adrian began reviewing death sentences personally. Where older kings might have delegated, the boy demanded every detail: the accused words, their family ties, their supposed errors of faith. One record tells of Father Dorian, a mild-mannered priest accused of clinging to old rites. Adrian read the charges carefully, lips pursed. "He denies the new hymns," Adrian said. "He honors saints we have cast aside. That is treason against heaven." "But, sire," Garrick protested, "he is old and harmless." "Harmless?" Adrian's voice cracked high with childish outrage. "Heresy is never harmless." The boy signed the warrant with a flourish. Witnesses reported he smiled as he dipped the quill. At the execution, Adrian insisted on attending. He sat in a carved chair as the crowd gathered, his small frame dwarfed by the throne-like seat. When the axe fell, he leaned forward, watching intently, then turned to Matthias. "Was that pleasing to God?" he asked. Matthias smiled thinly. "It was necessary, Majesty. And necessity is holy." That night, Adrian wrote in his journal, "The old priest was stubborn, but fire would have been better. Fire purifies quicker than the axe." Section 5. Shadows in the Palace. Adrian's cruelty soon extended to those closest to him. Servants who spilled wine were paraded in the courtyard, mocked by nobles at the boy's command. One maid accused of muttering forbidden prayers was flogged until she collapsed. Adrian watched, head tilted, as if studying an experiment. Elira, now 15, tried once more to reach him. "You are becoming what Father feared most," she whispered during a rare private moment. "A king without a heart." Adrian's eyes narrowed. "I am becoming what God demands." "God does not demand cruelty." He stepped closer, his voice chilling. "And how would you know his demands, sister? Have you spoken with him as I have?" Elira paled, realizing the boy she once comforted was slipping beyond reach. That night, Adrian wrote, "My sister is weak. Weakness tempts rebellion. Weakness must be corrected." Section 6. The Thought Police. By 12, Adrian instituted what courtiers called the Watch of the Faith. Neighbors were commanded to report on neighbors, children on their parents. Rewards were given for denunciations. Reports poured into the palace daily, accusations of whispered prayers, old hymns sung behind closed doors, candles lit on forbidden feast days. Adrian read them all eagerly, summoning accusers to describe details. "What did your father say?" he asked one trembling boy who had accused his parent. "He prayed for Saint Leora, your majesty." Adrian smiled, patting the boy's shoulder. "Then you have saved his soul by condemning his flesh." The father was executed within the week. The kingdom sank into paranoia. Families whispered in shadows, fearful their own children might betray them. And above it all, the boy king watched, convinced he was building God's kingdom brick by bloody brick. Section 7. The Breaking Point. By 14, Adrian's cruelty had become unrestrained. He ordered public humiliations, devised tortures, and personally corrected sentences to make them harsher. His obsession with purity consumed his family. Elira was confined to her chambers, accused of sympathizing with the enemy faith. Adrian drafted documents declaring her illegitimate, even plotting her death. "She is a stain," he raged to Matthias. "And stains must be burned out." Meanwhile, Garrick Thorne and other nobles began whispering of rebellion. But how to rebel against a boy who believed himself God's vessel? Section 8. The Dying Flame. The winter of 1554 began with an unease that settled over Alderstone Palace like a suffocating fog. For weeks, whispers ran through the corridors. The boy king was coughing blood. At first, the court tried to dismiss it as nothing. Adrian had always been frail, his skin too pale, his body too slight. But when the royal physicians were summoned, their grave faces spoke more loudly than words. Consumption, they murmured. Or perhaps something darker. Adrian's sickness revealed itself in violent bursts. One evening at supper, he doubled over, hacking red onto the white tablecloth. The courtiers froze, horrified, while Adrian straightened slowly, his lips stained crimson. He dabbed at them with a napkin and gave a chilling smile. "Even my blood," he whispered, "is a sacrifice for the purity of this kingdom." The days that followed were an agonizing spectacle. His once angelic face grew hollow, cheekbones sharp as blades. His hair, once a golden crown upon his head, began to fall in brittle clumps. His fingernails blackened and cracked. The stench of sickness clung to his chamber so strongly that servants fainted after lingering too long. And yet, he remained lucid enough to dictate. "Bring me parchment," he ordered Matthias. "Run," his voice a rasp. "We must finish what was begun." Too weak to sit upright, Adrian lay propped on pillows while scribes bent over their desks, recording his feverish words. "The Faith Guard must be established permanently. They will root out corruption in every village, every household. Let the people know that God sees all, and that his king's hand punishes in his stead." Matthias, himself aged and trembling, bowed with fervor. "It shall be done, Majesty." But some of the council balked. Garrick Thorne, who had weathered years of Adrian's tyranny, could no longer keep silent. He leaned close to Matthias after one such dictation and hissed, "The boy raves. His mind is lost. To follow these commands would burn the kingdom to ash." Matthias's eyes flicked toward him. "You call it raving. I call it prophecy." The king's chamber became a place of nightmares. Witnesses recorded his hallucinations. Shadows on the walls he claimed were angels urging him to greater cruelty. Whispers he swore were God's voice telling him to kill every last sinner. Elira was permitted to see him only once. She entered quietly, the scent of death clinging to the air. Adrian's eyes flickered open, sunken yet still burning with fanatic light. "Sister," he croaked. Elira clasped his hand, cold and skeletal. "I am here, Adrian. Rest. Let go of these burdens." He coughed, a wet, choking sound. "No. I must not rest. They wait, the heretics, the liars. If I close my eyes, they will rise again." "You are 15. Elira whispered through tears. "You should be thinking of peace, of forgiveness." Adrian's lips curled. "Forgiveness is for cowards. You would see them win." His grip tightened, weak but trembling with fury. "When I die, do not weep. Weep for yourself. Weep for Ormandia, if it falls back into corruption. Elira pulled away, sobbing. The king spent his last weeks alternating between delirium and chilling lucidity. He called for lists of names, noble families to be executed, villages to be purged. He demanded reports of loyalty, even as his body rotted beneath him. His final coherent command was given on a stormy night. Lightning illuminated the chamber as he rasped to Matthias. "Burn them all. Every last one. If I cannot cleanse this land, you must. Promise me." Matthias bowed, tears in his eyes. "I promise, Majesty." Hours later, Adrian convulsed violently, his cries filling the palace halls. His skin turned a ghastly greenish hue, his body leaking sores that no medicine could soothe. Some whispered poison had hastened his death, perhaps even administered by desperate physicians who could no longer watch his suffering, or by nobles who feared what he might do if he lived longer. But whether by disease or dagger, the boy was dying. And with him, an empire trembled. Section 9. Collapse of the Dream. Adrian's death on the morning of July 3, 1554, was both an end and a beginning. The news spread first through Alderstone Palace, carried on hushed breaths. Servants, long terrorized by his whims, clasped hands and whispered prayers of relief. Nobles looked at one another with unspoken recognition. The nightmare was over. And yet none dared show their relief openly. A king's death was no celebration, especially not one who had believed himself divine. In the council chamber, Garrick Thorne stood before the others, his voice steady for the first time in years. "The boy is gone. His last commands need not bind us." Matthias Runn rose, gaunt and pale, fury in his eyes. "How dare you? He was God's chosen. His words were not his own, but heaven's. His words," Garrick snapped, "would have drowned this kingdom in blood. Already the people are broken. Families torn apart. Shall we slaughter what remains?" A silence fell. Several councillors lowered their gazes, unwilling to meet Matthias's stare. That night, Garrick quietly ordered the dissolution of the Faith Guard. Informants were dismissed, prisons opened, survivors of Adrian's purges released. Villages wept as husbands, wives, and children stumbled home after years in chains. But relief was tangled with grief. Many had no families left to return to. Too many had burned, too many had been silenced. In the palace gardens, Elira walked alone. The air smelled of summer roses, but she could not find joy. Her brother was gone, the same boy she had once tried to coax into laughter, now a memory of blood and terror. She remembered his cold words on his deathbed, "Forgiveness is for cowards." She shivered. The people's reaction was complicated. Some muttered that Adrian had been a tyrant, a monster in the body of a child. Others whispered that perhaps he had truly been cursed, a vessel too fragile to bear the weight of destiny. And a few, the zealots he had inspired, still knelt in the streets, mourning him as a martyr. Section 10. Legacy of Fear. Years later, the name Adrian IV was still spoken with dread. In the villages of Ormondia, mothers warned their children, "Do not lie, or Adrian will come for you." In taverns, old men muttered of the days when neighbors betrayed one another for a loaf of bread and the boy king's favor. The records he left behind, journals filled with neat handwriting and grotesque fascination, painted a chilling picture. Diagrams of torture devices, notes on which punishments purified quickest. Lists of names crossed out with ink once wet from his eager quill. Historians who read them centuries later described the writings as the anatomy of a child's madness. Matthias Runn faded into obscurity after the king's death. Some claimed he wandered into the wilderness, raving of divine visions, never to be seen again. Others believed Garrick had quietly arranged his disappearance to prevent another zealot from seizing power. Elira eventually took a place on the council, guiding Ormondia with caution. But she never married, never bore children. Those who knew her said she carried too many ghosts. And Adrian himself, the boy king who should have been his kingdom's salvation, became instead its warning. He was remembered not as a monarch, but as a shadow. A reminder that cruelty can wear a child's face, that unchecked power can twist even the innocent into something monstrous. poets would later write. The crown was too heavy for the child, and so it crushed him, and nearly crushed us all. Yet some still wondered, what if he had lived? What if his frail body had survived into adulthood? Would Ormandia have endured a reign so suffocating, so brutal, that the very memory of freedom would have vanished? In death, Adrian gave his people release. But the scars of his reign never fully healed. And so, his story endures, a reminder of what happens when prophecy, power, and paranoia converge in the hands of a child who believed himself chosen by God.